Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player. Well, as promised, we continue on our fairly successful series of videos on the different classes that one can play and looking at the classes from a narrative perspective rather than from anything else. Now, we've been getting lots of requests from you guys as to what you would like us to cover next and to have a look at next. And the Paladin was one that came up quite frequently because the Paladin has been, and I think will be for quite some time, always considered to be the dumb choice, the party pooper who is going to make sure everyone is lawful good and no one commits crime and everything is awfully boring. Well, I've been trying to revamp the Paladin and various systems that I've played over the years, trying to make the Paladin a little bit more flexible, a little bit less anal retentive, and a little bit more fun to play. Now, I think the Paladin has some huge potential and some wonderful story options and should be played more often, but there are things that get in the way. Now, something that all of you youngsters might not remember was in 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, that's the 1980s, mind you, there was a thing called a kit, and the Paladin kits were absolutely mind-blowingly wonderful. And I'm going to be rehashing some of those Paladin kits here for those of you that didn't have the joy of playing Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, where the Paladin was at his most party pooperish. He was literally the paragon of good and law and justice and everything right in the world, and so it was very difficult to play with a party that contained anything other than good characters. So Thief was out, wizards who used bad magic were out, priests who used dark spells were out, druids were basically out. Rogues, rangers, anyone who had a dubious background was out because the Paladin was in and had such strict rules that they had no other choice. That has laxed over the time, over the iterations of Dungeons & Dragons, to the point now that the Paladin is, in my opinion, a fairly well-rounded class with some cool powers and the ability to see beyond just their codex or their religious canon that they have to follow. So let's have a look at the Paladin after that long preamble. The merits of a Paladin are fairly obvious. In MMOs around the world, the Paladin is referred to as the cockroach. The reason being you cannot kill a Paladin. Paladins get the advantage of having melee combat, heavy armor, and being able to bedeck themselves in a variety of defensive shields and things like that, as well as their magical faith, which will protect them beyond. And then, of course, they have the added advantage of the healing that comes with being a high-level Paladin, and the healing will keep that said Paladin going just that much longer. So the Paladin has the advantage of bringing together the Cleric spells and the warrior skills all bundled up in a nice heavy suit of plate armor. This is a good combination if you like to live for a long time. So the Paladin's merits are that it has combat, it has healing, it's got melee, it also has cool things like the Paladin's mount, that famous warhorse or Pegasus or Hippogriff or war dog or whatever mount is appropriate to your particular Paladin and deity. And of course they have religion. Now the religious side of things, in my opinion, is something that makes them the most interesting of the classes. The Cleric, of course, is a priest, and we'll cover the Cleric later on, but the Paladin is someone who fights on behalf of their god, trying to enact or enable or bring about their god's views and opinions in the world. Much more so than the Cleric. The Cleric can sit back and just kind of go, well, you know, it's not exactly how I do it, but, well, it's your choice. The Paladin is the one who has to embody the god and go out there and work on behalf of their god. That is their job. By definition, they are a representative warrior class of their deity. So you've got these really cool elements that you can play with. You've got a combat aspect, you've got the healing aspect, you've got the religious aspect, you've got the mount aspect. So there are a lot of things that are particularly cool about the Paladin class. The cons of a Paladin class, of course, are the restrictive canon or codex that they have to live by. Usually the deity will have a certain set of rules, or the game system itself will have a certain set of rules about what the Paladin can and can't do, what they can and can't accept. And generally speaking, this is where the Paladin has his most greatest adversary is in these rules that usually dictate that the Paladin must enforce their particular laws at all times. And those laws are frequently in opposition with the rest of the party. So it's about how do we work with that? How do we work with that opposition, with that negative dolling, that stickler in the mud that's going to keep the party from doing what they want to do rather than what the Paladin's rules say they should do. Because if you think about it now, the biggest challenge is that you've got a player who's chosen to play the Paladin, and it's the Paladin's rules that are restricting the party. No other class has this as a ability or a negative, where the class choice is mechanically affecting everybody else in the party out of game as well as in game. So it's an interesting challenge, and it's one that I think can be overcome quite easily with some creative role-playing. They are not focused either. Paladins are not focused. They're very scattered people. No, Paladins are not focused in terms of they're not a melee character, specifically. They're not a healing character, specifically. They're not a divine spellcaster, specifically. So they are not a fighter. They are not a cleric. They are not either one of those two things. They are this sort of mishmash in between, taking arguably the best of both worlds together. So there is a certain lack of focus that Paladins have in that area, and that is a potential negative. Speaking of potentials, if we look at the potential of the Paladin has this link with their divine being that is second to none. The cleric is there fulfilling the divine's will, fulfilling the divine's rituals, and making sure that the flock is there doing what they need to do. And yes, the cleric is very combative. They can also wear heavy armor and wield maces and run around and do all sorts of wonderful damage. But the Paladin is the one who is there representing their god as a shining example, as a leading light on the planet. So the Paladin's potentials are these epic quests, these god-inspired quests that allows the Paladin a certain agency to be a little bit important, as a matter of fact. So their quests can be taken to a whole nother level, which, again, is not something that necessarily a standard fighter is going to have. A rogue isn't going to have a god necessarily looking upon them and judging them for their actions as harshly as the god would for a Paladin. So there's a lot of pressure, and that means that we can have some great epic quests with the Paladin. The Paladin, as much as they're unfocused, they're also fairly balanced. They bring the divine spellcaster together with the melee character. So there is a certain balance there which allows them to become a very good, very all-round leader who understands magic and who also understands melee. So there is a very good potential for the Paladin to be the leader class. Now, if we're going to look at modern-day examples of that, Leonardo from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is, in my opinion, a fantastic example of A, a Paladin, and B, a good leader. He's not the greatest fighter, he's not the smartest either, but he is the one who brings balance to those three other misfits and makes sure that he enacts the will of his sensei. He is the Paladin of Splinter and Splinter's ways and the ways that Splinter believes in. So for me, that is a good example of how a Paladin can be expressed. And if you look at the traditional series or even the reboot, Leonardo has always had a conflict with the hot-headed Raphael who wants to go out there and just save the day, and he tries to bring him back with some thought, with some contemplation, following the laws and tenets that Splinter has set down, and he reins in Donatello when Donatello goes off and starts to invent crazy and wonderful stuff. He brings voice to that, reason to that, and gives voice to that reason that he brings. So that is a potential of the Paladin, is to be this really great center pin around which the rest of the party bounces around and is brought back to ground by the Paladin. Now, an important point here with this potential for the Paladin to rein in everybody is that when the Paladin tries to force their law, that's when there's pushback, not only from the characters, but from the players' characters as well. So as a Paladin character, you need to be very careful in terms of how you enact those changes, suggestions, and insights. And that's important to remember. And that, for me, is one of the great potentials of the Paladin, is that you've got this wonderful space that you've got to try and walk this line, pulling people in line without losing them. Because if you lose them, well, then you're playing a Paladin in the completely wrong way. You're playing a Paladin how everybody perceives a Paladin should be played, which is, in my opinion, wrong, as this forceful, my way or the highway type of approach. That's not going to ever work. And I don't think that's how Paladins should be played or had ever been intended to be played. I just think it's how it's been manifested. Now, if we look at the different types of Paladins, this for me is something that was a very interesting exercise to do. And I did go back to 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons and the Paladin's Handbook, which was released specifically for the Paladin, to look at what they did with the Paladin. Because on the surface, the Paladin is a tank who runs around in armor, hits stuff, heals stuff, and then prays a lot. Oh, and then tells everyone what to do. That is the broad strokes view of Paladins in role-playing games. At least it certainly is in my circle of awareness. So if we look at the Paladin, the very first type of Paladin is the Paladin. Just a champion of a god who runs around posing his judgment, kind of like Judge Dredd, and saying, right, this is wrong, you shall be smited, for it is wrong, and I am right. For I have a symbol saying, I am right. Now, the idea here is that this is the stereotypical Paladin, and yes, you can certainly play that type of Paladin, there's nothing wrong with that, but I challenge you to try and find ways in which the Paladin makes it a little bit less domineering and more suggestive, more caring, more assertive perhaps, but also more understanding. People are fallible. People make mistakes. That's why there are things like Paladins and Clerics to help guide them on the right way. So rather than telling people what they should do, a better approach, and this I hold true in real life as well, is one should be the example that is set. I do not think you should do that, and so I have not done it myself. You want to break into the castle. There's got to be a better way. Can't we talk? Can't we negotiate our way in? Can't we find a better solution than breaking in? No, we can't. All right, well then we're going to break in, but we're going to break in and get exactly what we want. We're not going to hurt anyone. We're not going to steal anything else. We're just going to get what we want, because that would be the best solution out of a worse situation. So that to me is what a true Paladin should be doing. Now, some of the other Paladin types that I came up with, or that I have seen in the past, is the desperate escapee. Now, if you look at Pulp Fiction, if you look at stories of Paladins, people who embody their god's desire, their god's will, their god's law, people who embody those. I've already mentioned people like Leonardo. The desperate escapee is a Paladin who has to be a Paladin of their god because they know their god exists and there is no alternative, but they're trying to escape and they can't. Constantine in that film with old, what's his face? Anyway, him in that movie, Constantine, he, in my opinion, is a Paladin. He goes about fulfilling and following the laws and tenets of those that are in power, but he doesn't have much of a choice. He can't escape his fate. He is destined to always do this. So a Paladin who does what needs to be done because he knows the consequences, the alternatives, are diabolically disastrous, is a Paladin who acts reluctantly. And that, to me, is a very interesting Paladin. Not a morose, depressed Paladin, but one who has accepted his fate and has decided that, well, the alternative is far worse, so this must be done. So the desperate escapee, or the reluctant Paladin, if you will, is another example of a good one. The last of his kind. Now, we don't often see these as Paladins, but frequently in novels, in movies, we come across the last of their kind. You are the last great warrior of the Order of the Rose, and so you are the only one who can guide everyone to salvation. This is a great opportunity to play a paladin who is someone who comes from an order that has been destroyed. The Last Templar, for example, might be someone who comes with a whole lot of rules and regulations which make people better. But no one remembers them. They've been forgotten. They've been lost. Whatever the case might be. The idea is that you are the last of your kind. You have these rules that you follow, and you follow them because that's what you've always done, and it will help ultimately re-establish a new order in the future. So that, to me, is a very interesting paladin to play out. The Helpless Hero. Now, this is a paladin which could be very gimmicky. It's a paladin who is basically the helpless hero. They can't help but be the hero. Now, I had an opportunity to play with an individual who played a hero, a paladin, as a matter of fact, and who inspired me to come up with this idea of the helpless hero. Their paladin was honest, good-natured, kind-hearted, and just did the right thing, because that was the right thing to do. That, to me, is a helpless hero. That's a person who can't help but be good and just and caring and kind and leading and just doing the right thing. That's not a paladin who is enforcing their will. That's a paladin who's doing it that way because, well, that's the way it should be done. And to do it any other way is unconscionable. So the helpless hero is a lot of fun. The Blackguard, of course, is the paladin who's gone in the opposite direction and has forsworn their vows. Now, for me, an important thing to look at here is that I have never played my paladins according to an alignment system. In 2nd edition, paladins had to be lawful good. It started to wax a little bit in 3rd edition, and I think by 5th edition we don't care anymore, which is a good thing. A paladin of an evil god should enact evil acts. That doesn't make them a black paladin or a black guard or a black warden or whatever you want to call your anti-paladins, your dark negative paladin. A paladin who purposefully goes against their god is a blackguard. A paladin who fights and rebels against a specific god because they believe in that god and they believe that god to be wrong. That is very different from an evil paladin or an unlawful paladin who kills babies whilst they sleep in their mother's wombs. That is not an evil or a negative paladin. That is a paladin who is, by all circumstances, doing the right thing according to their god. So a blackguard is a very interesting paladin, one who's trying to bring down the god that they worship in this really bizarre sort of parent-teenager type relationship, with the teenager rebelling against the god and fighting against them, and the god kind of going, yes, that's so cute, you're fighting against me. Well, you're going to find it's very difficult all out there on your own until eventually the paladin is strong enough to take on that god. Now, another type, which is almost the exact opposite, is the Peacock. This is a paladin who prides themselves on their shining armor, their big plumes, their war horse that they ride in on and save damsels in distress, or they save princes who are in distress and they themselves are a damsel who is not in distress, or however you want to work that combination. The Peacock is the paladin who is pretty, the paladin who is beautiful, divine, graceful, and the embodiment of everything that is pure and wonderful with the deity, assuming that's what the deity likes. A peacock is a lot of fun to play because they will do everything in their power to make sure that they look good. Now, a fighter could be a peacock, I suppose, but the fighter doesn't have that divine glow that the paladin has, or that almost cat-like sense of satisfaction with self, that they are just better than anyone else. So the peacock is an interesting angle to take, and of course you can mix these together and mold and evolve the character over time. Then finally, and this class comes straight out of Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, is the Hospitalier, or the Hospitalier, it's the only way I can say it. They called them the Hospitalier. It is basically the paladin who has forsworn any form of combat, or at least murder. They will engage in defensive combat, but they will not kill anything. And if they do, they are in violation of their faith and their god will be unhappy. They get benefits to their healing rights and that kind of thing. So it's basically like a combat medic, if you like. They run around and they keep everyone alive, but they themselves don't necessarily engage in mass murder. Now, it's an interesting class to play because you have the traditional tank who should be on the front lines. This one isn't. This one is in the back lines, keeping everyone alive and fighting off those that would prevent that from happening. So the Hospitalier is, I think, a very interesting take on the Paladin class. And of course, there are many, many other variations on Paladins, which I'm sure you can list below if you feel so inclined to share with the rest of us. Now, finally, when we look at stories very similar to the potentials of the Paladin. The stories are epic quests, God-inspired narratives, the idea that there is this greater being looking out specifically for your character. Specifically, we're not talking general wash here, we're talking you have taken a vow, you have sworn a vow to your God. Now that's the next type of story that you can have, is the Vow Taking. Now I've got a Paladin in my other game, which is on Bacon RPG on the YouTube channel, and he is playing a Paladin, and he's playing a Paladin to what I think is a very good way of doing it. He knows what's right, he knows what's wrong, he sticks to what's right, but he doesn't enforce it on the others, unless they violate it in a very specific way. Now, he and I are engaged in a very long discussion about his vows. How does his Paladin take his vows? What does he have to say? What does he have to do? What does he need to go through in order to become an official Paladin of the Church? Now, that is something that I think is very important and something that's well, we have spent a lot of time on and is a great story quest, this taking of the vows. Because as a GM, I have to look at what else is going to happen to the rest of the party. As a player, he has to formally commit to the rules of his deity. Now, another option for the Paladin, of course, is the fall from grace story. A lot of players don't want to fall from grace. They don't want their Paladin to lose their powers. And for good reason. A Paladin without his powers is basically just a fighter, and not a very good one at that. So the idea of having this as a story is tricky, but from a narrative perspective, it cannot be any of the lesser stories. It is a powerful, powerful story because it sets the Paladin up for a fall. It takes the Paladin's powers away, so you as the player are forced to try and come up with narrative solutions, with practical solutions that your Paladin wouldn't normally have done because they would just rely on their powers. And of course it leads to the next type of story, which is the rise in grace. So you've fallen from grace and the return to grace. The redemption story. What an epic story. We watch these as movies and we read them as books and we enjoy them as plays all the time. The return to grace. The character who's fallen away and has refound themselves, has discovered their ultimate original reason for being a Paladin in the first place and has now going back to claim that. That is fantastic. It's a great, great story option. And then, of course, the tragic hero is the Paladin who wants to save everyone. The Paladin who knows that if they don't do the right thing, the world is going to come to an end. And then, because of their actions, because of their characters' their fellow party actions, all of these things, they fail anyway. The tragic hero. This is a very, very sad story of failure, and one that could lead to another character coming in to try and pick up that story, or that the character fails, they abandon their vows, they leave everybody, they go into a state of depression, and then they start to return again later on, or they just don't. It just ends tragically, and everyone gets melancholic about it. So, the Paladin is far more than just some dullard who stands in the corner telling people what they can and can't do. There is so much to this class that we can explore and discover, and there's this whole religious pantheon sitting above them, judging them all the time, pushing them to be better than the rest of the people around them. That is a very interesting class in my opinion, and one which I would encourage everybody to explore at least once, just to see what it's like to have all that pressure of the gods watching you all the time. Oh, it's tiring, but it can be incredibly rewarding. Let me know your thoughts on the Pally, the Paladin, the Paladin, as some people might pronounce him. pronounce it, and leave the comments below. Now, something that you can do is share this video with everyone. This week is sharing week. Sharing is caring, as they say. So share this video with all your other players, even if you don't play Paladins. Or your system doesn't support Paladins, well, maybe there's room for someone who wants to take up a religious warrior class and drive it into your next campaign. Until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of playing.